morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. I am joined at the desk by Spencer Brown, filling in for Robbie Suave while he's enjoying pasta and cannolis in Italy. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Spencer, I feel like I have to do the obligatory ask of how often you think of the Roman Empire.
You know, it used to be a lot more often when I was a kid playing video games, you know, that civilization game where you conquer the world, but lately, not so much.
Okay, all right. Well, then it's a departure from the rest of your ilk, apparently.
Apparently, yeah.
Apparently. All right, well, Michael Singleton will be back with us next week, so if you miss him, stick around for that. Spencer, what do we have up first today?
Well, House Republicans have a new bombshell allegation against Dr. Anthony Fauci. According to House Chairman James Comer, Dr. Fauci was secretly escorted into CIA agency headquarters to, quote, influence its COVID-19 origins investigation. In a new letter, Oversight Committee Republican Brad Wenstrup claims that, quote, information provided suggests that Dr. Fauci was escorted into Central Intelligence Agency headquarters without a record of entry and participated in the analysis to influence the agency's review of the origins of COVID-19. Republicans now have asked the Inspector General to release all documentation related to this and any other related meetings.
In response to Rising's request for a comment, a spokesperson for Dr. Fauci wrote, quote, these allegations reported by Chairman Wenstrup are categorically false. Earlier this week, Dr. Fauci appeared on MSNBC where he addressed his most outspoken critics.
I had to say it like it was, and I had to do it publicly. That triggered a degree of negativity towards me on the part of the far right, that all of a sudden, when you have anger, in some cases maybe justifiable anger of one ideological group against the other, you need a symbol like somebody has got to be the object of the anger.
But it's not just crazy. I mean, that's a man who wants to be president.
No, but what I'm saying, I'm going to get to that. Okay. What happens is that if you become the symbol of the object of people's anger, even people who know nothing about you know the fact that in my career, I've been involved in saving literally millions of lives that people, forget that.
All right, so let's start with this CIA story. I'm a little confused as to what we're supposed to take away from it. Maybe you can help me out. So the allegation, disputed, but the allegation is that the CIA and Fauci are in cahoots somehow. The implication of Fauci not having signed into the CIA and being escorted, quotation marks, seems to suggest there was something covert here about the CIA reaching out to the head then of the CDC to discuss what the likely origins of COVID were. What should we see? What should we believe about this? Is it conspiratorial? Is it improper for the CIA to have consulted Fauci? Is it something that needed to be hidden from the public? Is it something that makes you mistrust the CIA's assessment of whether or not lab leak theory is legitimate?
I think the later point you made about whether or not this was something that they were trying to keep hidden from the American people, I think we saw throughout this whole pandemic and Fauci's tenure that he often kept things from the public because he believed that they couldn't handle the truth, essentially. That was his line, and how he tried to, keep people from panicking was kind of his thing. So he makes it sound altruistic, but it seems like perhaps that wasn't. But then on just the face of him, going to the CIA and it not being reported, there aren't entry logs, it just creates that appearance of why are you sneaking around going to the CIA? Whether or not he was actually doing anything wrong, that just on its face makes it look very, it's sort of sketchy, Like if you have nothing to hide in your, top level government people discussing COVID and where it came from, you would think that you would want to show the American people that you're working really hard to get to the bottom of it, but just sneaking around kind of removes that appearance from it.
It seems like there's some interest in raising some implications about the CIA as an agency. What do you make of the fact that the Department of Energy and the FBI, the other agency that's often lumped in with the CIA when people are raising skepticism about what our government is covertly up to, the FBI was one of the agencies that came forward and said that it's more likely than not that lab leak theory is the correct origin theory for the COVID pandemic. Does that militate one way or another for you, and how suspicious we should be about what Fauci and the CIA were talking about, period?
I just, in general, am skeptical of what the government tells me, whatever it may be. But I think in this case, we saw a number of these federal agencies come up with their most likely theory for how the pandemic began and how we got COVID in public and then it spread. And it's been updated, very recently by some agencies who've kind of come around to saying a lab leak is the most likely way that this virus emerged. But I think it just goes to show that, the federal government does not know everything. Even if it does know everything, it's not going to tell us everything probably. And it just sort of reinforces this idea of getting your own information and not necessarily trusting what bureaucrats in D.C. are saying.
Yeah, I mean, this is a letter that was just made public yesterday and dated yesterday that's addressed to Inspector General Grimm. It says specifically that they have information gathered by the select subcommittee, that Anthony Fauci, then director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, played a role in the Central Intelligence Agency's review of the origin of COVID-19. The information provided suggests that Dr. Fauci was escorted into the CAA without record of entry, yada, yada, yada. And then it follows up by asking for a bunch of information that would confirm if this really in fact happened and what was discussed if the conversation actually took place. Given that we know what the government agencies have decided, or what at least tentative conclusions they've come to about the likelihood of lab leak being the real origin of the COVID pandemic, do you expect much to come out of this one way or the other? I mean, worst case scenario, from the perspective of people who believe that the government has been withholding information, right, is Dr. Fauci, who we know doesn't especially believe in lab leak theory, went there and said, yeah, I don't especially believe in lab leak theory. And the CAA says, okay, thank you. I mean, is this really the cover-up of the century?
I think probably COVID just in general, and this idea that we weren't ever going to get to the bottom of it. I think the Chinese Communist Party played a bigger role in the cover-up. Obviously there's been a limited ability on the behalf of the United States government and the World Health Organization to actually get into China to do investigations. The Chinese Communist Party, also acting very suspiciously, has denied inspectors the ability to go there, withheld medical records and things like that. But I do think there's sort of two options where the CIA calling in Dr. Fauci could be them calling in a public health official to say, here's the intelligence that our assets around the world have gathered. What do you make of this? Or, and again, because he's sort of sneaking around apparently or allegedly, he went in and, like you said, just said, I don't think this is a lab leak. I think this is natural, progression from an animal. And they took his word for it. Like maybe he went there to convince them versus just to read their evidence and say what it looks like. And obviously he had a vested interest because his theory sort of all along was that this was a natural phenomenon. It wasn't a lab leak. And he went to pretty great lengths in order to prevent the lab leak theory from gaining any traction, even on social media.
Is there any possibility that it was the other way around, that the CIA was articulating a preference for our national health institutes to weigh in saying that lab leak wasn't a likely theory?
That is also possible. I mean, it's the CIA, right? So who knows really what actually is going on inside that building in Langley and around the world. It's one of those things where, again, we need more oversight, but are we actually going to get the answers? The government has proven itself very capable at keeping things hidden if it wants to.
I mean, your point about the failure to investigate where the leak actually happened in China and the Chinese government's refusal to allow external investigation and having very limited domestic investigations, or at least not disclosing the results of domestic investigations, does point to the idea that that's the real source of the problem, and that's where answers lie to the extent that there are any, which for me raises the question about why there is so much wheel spinning about what are kind of domestic actors that ultimately don't have any firsthand knowledge of much of anything at all are up to. And it does seem to me that the lack of focus on someone like Dr. Fauci, as opposed to what the Chinese government or the Chinese scientists were potentially covering up, has to do with a reluctance to meddle with U.S.-Chinese relations. And so our geopolitical interests are being put above the interest in actually resolving what caused this pandemic in the first place. That being said, why do you think that there's so much continued focus on Anthony Fauci, the kind of attention that he was responding to in the clip that we watched at the top of this segment?
Yeah, I think sort of while all this is going on, there's also the questions that have been raised and evidence has been put forward by some members of Congress, including Senator Rand Paul, about what role Dr. Fauci may have played in the actual work on this gain-of-function research into viruses that could have created COVID-19 in the first place. And so I think that's why he's always going to be tied to this, because there's so many questions that have been raised, denials that he's made that have been, in some cases, debunked already by, funding, seeing things going back and forth between NIH and these research grants, whether those research projects are being conducted not just in the US, but also in China, in Wuhan specifically. And so he's always going to be at the center of this, because the question remains, what role did the U.S. government have potentially in the creation of COVID-19, and not just necessarily how did it escape from a lab potentially in Wuhan?
What, in your view, would be the most effective course of inquiry, given that Anthony Fauci is no longer even employed by the government? He's a retired citizen. To the extent that there are emails that might reveal what his thinking was at the time or what kind of directions he was giving at the time, those are obviously subject to FOIA requests and investigation and inquiries like the one that this letter is trying to get to the bottom of. But again, it does seem to be about Fauci the man as opposed to getting to the bottom of X, Y, and Z, which, I'm only cautious of because it does seem like it is sidestepping the problem. Like, it's very easy to whip people up in a fervor about an individual bad actor, which is what he's pointing to, although I'm not trying to absolve him of responsibility. But it does seem to be that if you knew that a base was very interested in vilifying him and vilifying people who made a lot of mistakes during the COVID era, but didn't actually want to get to the bottom of the party because bottom of the problem because you are also invested in preserving your relationships with the Chinese government, then you can seem like you're fighting without really fighting at all by just talking about Fauci all day in a way that doesn't get you any closer to actually getting to the bottom of what caused the pandemic. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and it's interesting too, like you were saying, having sort of Fauci the man, as straw man or not. Obviously, he was more than a straw man because he was running everything. But it is been interesting to see politically, not to go completely afield, but politically now in 2024, former President Trump kept him on, gave him an award on his way out of office. And so politically, it's not that Dr. Fauci is a Biden administration official. Obviously he's worked for presidents of both parties. And so you have, I think Fauci, whether he wants to or not, has become emblematic of just this larger problem of the expert class.
Sure.
And the people in DC who are unelected, who in Dr. Fauci's case are making just literally boatloads of money, more money than any other federal employee, and running around telling people things, apparently sneaking into the CIA, all this stuff. And so you've seen investigations go beyond just Fauci to say, what is the government still doing funding gain-of-function research? Is that something that we're continuing to undertake? So that does go beyond him and addresses sort of potentially the problem of making sure we don't have these zombie viruses being developed by U.S. tax dollars. But Fauci's just, this is going to be him. This is, whether he wanted to or not, this is how he left his official government post, and it's going to end up being kind of his legacy. Obviously he views it as his legacy is saving millions of lives, but I think a lot of other people view it as...
Well, prior to COVID, many people felt like his legacy was being on the wrong side of many issues during the AIDS crisis.
Correct.
But to your point about him obviously coming to national prominence under Donald Trump, do you think that this issue is going to be one that is helpful or hurtful to Donald Trump in the general election?
It's a very good question. Interestingly enough, back now months ago, maybe even a year ago, Trump was still at rallies sort of talking about how he gave us this vaccine, which again, saved lives, according to the numbers. And so, but then his own supporters booed him at his own rally.
Right.
And so that... Trump's handling of COVID is not going to help him, it seems, politically. And you've seen DeSantis and other campaigns really hit him for not getting rid of Fauci, for giving him an award, for basically handing him seemingly so much power by having him do all those briefings. And I think Trump is maybe going to have to answer for it, but obviously polling-wise, it's not hurting.
Yeah. All right. We'll continue to follow how the COVID issue affects the GOP nominee. More Rising after this. Do stick around.